So welcome everyone. My name is Jay Otto. I'm a researcher with the Center for Health and Safety Culture. And we're going to go ahead and get started with our webinar this afternoon. We really appreciate everyone able to join us. Just want to give you a little bit of setup about Webex. If you haven't been on Webex before, you can listen to the audio either over your computer speakers, but you can also do it with a phone. If for some reason you get disconnected, look for the little phone icon so that you can reconnect. Right now, everybody's phone is muted for the recording except for my own. We are recording this webinar, so you'll be able to watch parts of it later on if you want, or share it with others. And we'll send a link where you can find the recording at the end of or in a couple days. You also have the ability to use a chat box where you can send a chat to me or Kelly Hildebrand Hall, who's the host behind the scenes, who's running things. If you want to choose on your chat box who you send it to, if you send it to the host and the presenter, then I will also be able to see it. If you have a technical question, you can send that just to the host, which is Kelly, but I'm set up as the presenter, so if you send it to both the host and the presenter, then I can see those as well. You also have a chat box that you can use, or a question and answer box that you can use that you can send in any questions. And I'll try to keep an eye on those. Sometimes I try to answer those as we're going. Sometimes we'll wait and we'll answer those at the end. But I'll keep an eye out on those. All right, so just quickly a little bit about who we are. We're the Center for Health and Safety Culture. We're in the Western Transportation Institute at Montana State University. And we conduct research about how culture impacts health and safety. And all of our research is very applied, like this project. It's on real issues with real people. And we also think it's extremely important to bring the information out to folks like you who are doing the work, who are making a difference in the field. And so we also do a lot of work about training and provide guidance on ways to cultivate health and safer cultures. Our core issues that we focus on, we do a lot of work on traffic safety, but we also do work on the misuse of substances, domestic violence, and child well-being. And of course, we know these issues overlap. We know that the misuse of substances can absolutely contribute to a lot of challenges in traffic safety with impaired driving. We know that domestic violence can be aggravated by the misuse of substances, and child well-being, adverse childhood experiences and other things can lead to misuse of substances and traffic safety issues. So together, these issues are the leading causes of years of potential life lost. And a lot of our research is to explore how these overlap and are connected. But today we're going to be really talking about in the context of traffic safety. So this project that I'm sharing with you is sponsored by the Traffic Safety Culture Transportation Pooled Fund program. And that's a pooled fund where states get together and pool some of their transportation research dollars so that together they can do some bigger projects. And Sue Sillick is the manager of this pooled fund. She works for the Montana Department of Transportation, who's the host for the pooled fund. And you can see the listing of all the participating states there. So those states have contributed some dollars over the past 5 years, and has allowed us to do a number of projects. And we're getting ready to start a new pooled fund program. It happens about every 5 years. So we're going to kick a new one off in this fall. So if you're interested in being a part of that, just send Sue an email. You don't have to be a Department of Transportation to participate. Any organization can participate. So you might check in with Sue about that. And we'll talk a little bit about that at the end. But these are the folks who've sponsored this project. So today what we're going to look at are some of the objectives for the project, our general approach, what we learned, briefly talk about some recommendations and potential next steps, and then just talk a minute about some other research projects that you might be interested in that are also sponsored by the pooled fund, some of which will have some results very soon, some of which the research is still underway. But we want to help you connect the dots to some of the future work as well. So let's jump in some and talk about the objectives for this project. We wanted to look at the relationship and sort of how things were going in terms of law enforcement agencies and traffic safety enforcement. So we wanted to look at how were law enforcement leaders and officers prioritizing traffic safety relative to other public safety issues. We know that law enforcement has many issues that they must address, and we want to sort of see how that relative prioritization. We wanted to look at self-reported attitudes and beliefs and behaviors about traffic safety enforcement activities by officers. We wanted to look at law enforcement's perceptions of how traffic safety enforcement behaviors have changed in recent years. Some stakeholders were wondering whether traffic safety enforcement activities have been decreasing or increasing. And then we wanted to look at how the prioritization of traffic safety attitudes, beliefs, and enforcement behaviors and perceptions change, and perceptions of change vary between leaders and officers, agency types, and urban and rural settings. So we know that there are different kinds of enforcement agencies. Some of those have different missions, although all of them may have some degree of responsibility for traffic safety enforcement. We also know that demands can look different in urban and rural settings. So we wanted to examine some of those issues as well. So these were the big objectives we were seeking to examine. Let's talk now a little bit about our approach. So our overall model is that we were looking at how shared values on the left, sort of that prioritization of traffic safety as an issue of concern, were then also related to very specific attitudes and beliefs that were supportive of traffic safety enforcement behaviors. And then how those attitudes and beliefs were associated with actual engagement in traffic safety enforcement and behaviors. And of course, ultimately, we know through the research and other things that traffic safety enforcement can be a very important, viable strategy to improve traffic safety in the general population. Our research on this project was not to explore the connection in those last two boxes on the right. That's been pretty well established. We were really focusing on what's the relative prioritization? What are some of the attitudes and beliefs that are associated with engagement and behaviors? And what is the prevalence of engaging in traffic safety enforcement behaviors? Now, we specifically looked at 4 enforcement behaviors: seatbelt enforcement, speeding and aggressive driving, impaired driving, and distracted driving. Together, these are kind of at the leading, around the leading issues when we look at fatals or serious injury crashes. Of course, there are other factors as well. We couldn't ask about everything, so we thought it was good just to prioritize and focus on these 4 for this survey. So you'll see things broken out by these 4, and then we also looked at these 4 aggregated together in certain circumstances. We use a behavioral model to start to understand the relationship between values, assumptions, various kinds of beliefs, and then an individual's willingness and intention to engage in a behavior, and then their actual engagement in the behavior. So on the far right of this model, the risky or protective behavior, what we included here was the protective behavior of officers engaging in traffic safety enforcement. And then on the left of that, all the boxes to the left, we examine different kinds of beliefs that would be predictive of whether an officer engaged or not. And so that's what we're going to explore, just to give you a little bit of sort of the science behind how we figure out what kinds of beliefs to examine. All right, so a little bit about the participants. We engaged agencies in 4 states. So we picked 2 kind of urban states, those were Connecticut and Illinois, and 2 kind of more rural states, Idaho and Montana. And then within those states, we recruited a statewide agency, municipal agencies, and county or sheriff offices. A county agency, or in many cases, that's a sheriff's office. So we want to be very clear up front. This is not a representative sample of all law enforcement agencies across the country. This is very much a convenience sample. So what we'll look at are the patterns that we were able to ascertain from these participating agencies, but we can't necessarily extend the assumption that those same patterns exist with other agencies, although it's probably likely. But we'll also end with some tools that you could use within your own agency to explore some of these, so that you can take what we've learned and apply it within a very specific agency. The final participation, we had 19 different agencies participate. We had 4 statewide, 9 municipal, and 6 sheriff's offices. We had a total of 568 officers. The bulk of those were from statewide agencies, but we also had a good number from municipal and sheriff's offices. So that just gives you a feel for the breakdown of who was participating in the survey. And we did additional analyses to look at each one of those different groups. And we'll talk about some of those differences as we walk through. All right, for the statistics geeks in the room, here just some background summary. On the left-hand side are all the scales that we measured. Whenever we can, we use multiple items or questions to ascertain a certain scale. The next column shows the internal reliability of those scales as measured by Cronbach's alpha. And what we're looking for is a Cronbach alpha of 0.7 or above. And overall, these are very good. So it's showing that the items that we used for each scale were pretty consistent with internal reliability. You can see the number of respondents is pretty good. For the most part, our participants answered the vast majority of all the questions. You can see what the means were. The scales all range from 1 to 7. So you can see in general, we're not up at the edge, but we're above 4, which is sort of the middle. And you can see the standard deviation, which gives us an indication we've got some wiggle room. We could have gone above or below on many of the means, but we weren't too worried about ceiling or floor effects. So just to give you a little bit of background and context for some of the scales that we used. Okay, so this is one way that we'll look at some of the data. So I'll just take a moment and explain how to interpret this slide. Each piece of data is listed across the row. And in this case, we've broken apart the 3 different kinds of agencies. The gray are statewide agencies, the blue are sheriff's offices, and the red stripe are municipal agencies. And what the box represents is the 95% confidence interval of the mean. So right in the middle of the box, you can imagine is the mean, the average for this response. And then the width of the box is the 95% confidence interval. So we asked officers thinking back over the past 12 months, how often have you engaged in the following traffic safety enforcement activities? We looked at seatbelt. And what you can see is the statewide agencies were reporting engaging in that slightly less than weekly. And we can see that the sheriff and municipal offices are less than that. They're more in the 7 to 11 times a year. Now you can see that the blue and the red striped don't overlap exactly, but they overlap some. So there we'd say, statistically they're pretty similar. We're not going to say that there's a big difference between sheriffs and municipals in terms of seatbelt enforcement. So overall from this picture, you can start to see that statewide agencies are engaging in traffic safety more often than other agencies. And that's kind of what we expect. That's a little bit more of their mandate relative to, let's say, a sheriff's office or a city police department. We can see that maybe aspects of speeding and aggressive driving enforcement is a little bit more prevalent among some than maybe seatbelt enforcement. And maybe impaired driving is in there as well, and distracted driving. So they're all somewhat similar, but you can see a slightly different relative engagement in these in basic enforcement activities. Now, we asked about relative to all the issues that law enforcement addresses, how would the following people prioritize traffic safety and enforcement? And then we broke this down by agency type. Now, the first row is an indication, how would you respond? So this is how the individual officer would respond. All the other rows are the officer's perceptions of how other people would respond. Now, we don't know if that perception is accurate or not, but we do know from the research that how an officer, or really anybody, perceives other people prioritizing an issue will influence their own prioritization of the issue. So it's an important belief to measure, but we don't know in these communities how, for example, elected officials do prioritize traffic safety. That might be an interesting question to ask. Here we're really asking the perception of the officer. Now, this perception was strongly associated with their engagement in traffic safety behaviors. So the higher they prioritized it, the more likely they were to engage in those behaviors. Likewise, the higher they perceived others prioritized it, the higher they prioritized it. So what you can see is that, again, statewide agencies tended to prioritize it maybe a little bit higher than municipal or sheriff agencies. And again, that goes back to probably mission and mandate. But you can also see that in general, officers' perception of other officers within their office, they perceive them as prioritizing it less than they themselves do. And that may or may not be accurate, but that's an important thing for us to note, because that misperception about how other officers prioritize it may influence some officers. And that influence could be perhaps negative if they're perceiving others don't prioritize it as highly. We can see how they perceive their immediate supervisor prioritized it, as well as the highest commanding officer in their office. It's also interesting to note when we move outside of their office that their perception is that other key stakeholders are prioritizing it lower. That, again, may or may not be true and may be an important opportunity for some really good conversations. We broke out prosecutors, judges, and then just the general population, most adults. So we'll continue to explore these different stakeholders and officers' perceptions of them, but you can start to see here some interesting patterns. We asked about how current engagement in each of these had changed in the past 5 years, and there was no strong pattern. Even within an individual agency, some officers would say it had decreased, and some officers would say it had increased within the same agency. Overall, the only one we sort of see a general uptick is in distracted. We generally saw more people reporting that distracted had increased relative to decreased. You can also guess a certain percentage said neither. Those are the ones, each of these adds up to 100, and you're only seeing the decrease or the increase. So those that weren't shared are saying neither. So overall, we didn't see any strong patterns that enforcement had decreased or increased overall. Now, we asked about a general attitude about traffic safety enforcement activities, and we used a couple of different what are called semantic differentials. We looked at sort of, do you see it as useful or useless, wasteful or efficient, boring or exciting, and harmful or beneficial? And you can see overall, officers perceived it as having a positive attitude. That is, in general, all the averages were to the right of the neutral. They tended to see it as useful, efficient. Maybe exciting was a little bit less on the scale, and seeing it as beneficial. Now, we have to remember that these are averages. There are certainly officers who would rate it higher, and there were officers who rated it lower. And that'll be something we'll want to explore as maybe perhaps some of you are talking with officers within an individual agency, and how we might seek to grow positive attitudes about traffic safety enforcement. And we'll look at some beliefs associated with that. We also don't see drastically different beliefs across different agencies. So that was interesting too. Here were some key beliefs that we wanted to look at. These I just pulled off some of the leading beliefs. We looked at some others, and I've shown here the percentage who disagreed, the percentage who neither agreed nor disagreed, and the percentage who agreed. So most, about half disagreed that traffic safety enforcement efforts are a waste of time because prosecutors and judges will not follow through. But you can see that there were a third that did agree with that, and a number who neither disagreed nor agreed. So this is concerning. Now, we don't know in these communities whether those prosecutors and judges will not follow through, but that's the perception of these officers, and that absolutely was associated with their attitude about enforcement, their prioritization of enforcement, and their engagement in enforcement activities. So again, we do a lot of work around culture and misperceptions of culture. And perhaps this is true in a certain community or it's a misperception, but regardless, it's an opportunity to have some important conversations and maybe grow engagement by prosecutors and judges. We wanted to see whether officers recognize traffic safety as a significant public health issue. And you can see about 2/3 agreed that traffic crashes are a leading cause of death and injury in their jurisdiction. Some disagreed, and again, we don't know for each of those jurisdictions, but certainly from the large-scale data, traffic safety tends to be a major public health issue, especially when we're looking at younger folks. When we're talking about individuals, about age 5 to 25, traffic safety incidents are the leading cause of death. So it certainly is a very significant public health issue, but sometimes it happens somewhat regularly that we don't connect with it as much relative to, let's say, a plane crash or a disease. We asked some questions about whether they'd be recognized within their agency. And here you can see that about half agreed they'd be recognized, but a half couldn't agree that they'd be recognized. So that's an interesting opportunity. That's certainly something an agency can do without a whole lot of cost. We wanted to look at how they perceived their supervisor would respond to them. And here it was better. About 7 out of 10 agreed that their supervisor would think positively of them for regularly engaging. But, 3 out of 10 did not feel that way. We, again, checked in about local prosecutors and judges do not seem to support our traffic safety enforcement efforts. About a little over a third agreed and about a third disagreed. And so that's very important and could be opportunity for some dialogue there between prosecutors and judges and law enforcement leaders. And then we wanted to check in their perception of community. And this community gets upset with our agency if we engage in traffic safety enforcement activities. About half disagreed, but about half didn't disagree. A quarter agreed and about a quarter neither agreed nor disagreed. And of course, it's difficult when you're doing traffic safety enforcement because obviously the person that you cite tends not to be happy about it in the moment. And maybe others who have been cited will raise a clamor with the city council or the county commission. But there's a very large silent majority that supports traffic safety enforcement, but never says anything about it. And sometimes those folks' beliefs are lost and officers can feel that they're not supported. And again, all of these beliefs were strongly associated with a positive attitude or a negative attitude, as well as prioritization, as well as engagement in the behavior itself. So these are important beliefs. Okay, we also wanted to look at whether law enforcement officers should regularly engage in traffic safety enforcement activities. This is called an injunctive norm. And again, individual officers was the you. They agreed somewhat strongly that they should engage in these activities, but their perception of support among others decreases as you increase in social distance. And those might be important misperceptions to clarify. Again, we don't know what most prosecutors or judges or adults in a community thought, but it influences what the officer thinks and how the officer behaves. So those are some opportunities that we might want to clarify. And in our survey work, and we've done this in a number of states, we tend to see that in general, the broad population is supportive of traffic safety enforcement. But of course, individuals who get cited in the moment aren't particularly happy. We also wanted to look at barriers. What are barriers for engaging in traffic safety enforcement activities? Of course, time is always a challenge for everyone, although it's interesting, it wasn't drastically different between the three kinds of agencies. So even though maybe a sheriff's office has additional duties, their rating of barrier wasn't drastically different than, let's say, a statewide agency. Lack of equipment tended not to be strongly a barrier. Lack of support from their immediate supervisor wasn't indicated as a strong barrier, nor lack of support from their commanding officer. Greater than those was a lack of follow through by prosecutors and judges. So if they didn't feel like judges and prosecutors were following up, that was recognized as a barrier. And training was kind of low. Now, again, recognize that these are averages. Within any given group, there could be officers who would rate some of these as a barrier, and that could be an opportunity to address that barrier with that specific officer. And again, at the end, we're going to talk about a tool that might help reveal that within a specific agency. So we also wanted to check in on their general knowledge around some traffic safety issues. So how well do they know the locations with traffic safety concerns in their jurisdiction? And overall, they knew it pretty well. And that's usually expected. They're out in the field. They're responding to crashes. They know where the crashes occur. They know their jurisdictions maybe better than anybody else. But when we asked them about how well they're briefed about crash data for their jurisdiction, this was much lower. And this might be an opportunity. If some of the folks on this webinar are involved from a DOT side or a Department of Public Safety, maybe there's some opportunities to collect some of that crash data and feed it back to law enforcement officers who can then do some briefs with, or law enforcement leaders who can then do briefs with their officers so that they feel more informed about that. The research would show, and it was consistent with this study, the more knowledge that officers had, the more likely they were to have a positive attitude about it, the more likely they're to prioritize and engage in it. Likewise, they had a lower level of sort of being briefed about traffic safety enforcement activities within their jurisdiction. So perhaps there are opportunities to enhance communication between different departments about traffic safety enforcement activities, or just keeping everybody on the same page with what was going on. So there do seem to be some opportunities to increase the knowledge of officers about traffic safety enforcement activities. We checked in with their participation in training in the past 3 years. So what you're seeing is the percentage of officers who responded to the survey who indicated they had participated in this training in the past 3 years. You can see statewide agencies are pretty strong on many of these. And you can see where there's some lower levels and some opportunities to improve. In general, there's a fair amount of there's obviously a significant number of officers who have been trained, but there's certainly an opportunity to grow these training opportunities. Again, we did find that the training was associated, more training was associated with a more positive attitude or prioritization and engagement in the behavior. So training was leading to more enforcement activities, and there might be some opportunities to enhance training for officers. We know it's difficult just in terms of time and cost, but it certainly was associated with their engagement in activities. So that's a little bit about what we learned through the study. There's more in the comprehensive report, but those were sort of the big picture highlights. Now I want to sort of talk about how we distilled some of these ideas into some recommendations and some potential next steps. So our first recommendation was that we think it's valuable to frame conversations and efforts to increase enforcement around concern for safety, which I think many officers do, but it's always a good reminder to use that frame, and an agreement with a 0 deaths and 0 injury goal. We know that many states, I think most states, have adopted a goal of achieving 0 deaths and serious injuries on our highways. In virtually all of our traffic safety surveys, we ask the general population how much they agree with that goal. And overwhelmingly, the general population agrees with the goal of 0 deaths and serious injuries. Not 100%, but into the 70s and 80% agree. So this is a good way to frame a conversation as a law enforcement officer when you're talking about enforcement with the general population. This helps to establish it as a public health issue and not an enforcement for enforcement's sake issue. It's not an issue about raising revenue for the town or the county. This is a public health issue. And in general, most of the population then tends to be supportive of efforts seeking to improve public health. Any ways that can be done to increase the prioritization of traffic safety and traffic safety enforcement among officers will increase engagement in those activities. So we'll look at some different areas, but that might be addressing some misperceptions with other key stakeholders, like prosecutors or judges or elected officials. That might be addressing some misperceptions within the agency. How officers perceive the prioritization of other officers and how officers perceive the prioritization of their leaders. There are a number of ways to increase prioritization, but simply talking about it and calling it out as a priority and then engaging other stakeholders to share in that conversation will definitely help shift some of those beliefs. Leaders and supervisors should establish clear expectations for regular and consistent traffic safety enforcement. This is basic management ideas that in general staff and officers will align with the expectations established with them. We could clearly see that in the survey. I think sometimes leaders can become complacent or feel like they've said it enough, but sometimes we all know you have to say things over and over again. So it's just important for leaders and supervisors to clearly establish those expectations for consistent enforcement. The more you do that, the more you're going to get consistent enforcement. As you're able to seek to reduce some of the barriers to regular and consistent enforcement, maybe that looks like in terms of time. Some agencies that might look like equipment or other things, and it's a conversation within each agency, but barriers certainly can play a role. As available, again, bolstering the training and the knowledge about traffic safety enforcement will increase positive attitudes and beliefs as well as engagement. Some of that could be through the formal training that's available and trying to partner with other agencies. If you're a stakeholder who's trying to increase traffic safety enforcement, you're outside of the agency, maybe seeking resources to help agencies to be able to access training, or talking to agencies to see what we could do to help them access training. And then maybe creating some tools to bolster their knowledge, some briefs on what are the crash data for your jurisdiction. We know that some localities can get maps of the traffic crashes and where they occur. We felt that the officers seemed to report that they tended to know where the crashes were, but maybe just having some broader crash data so that those officers were more informed about their local jurisdiction's crash statistics. And with the crash databases, that's something that we can do more and more through some automation and other tools where we can give, a jurisdictional report. And then we created a brief little dialogue guide that could facilitate some good conversations between leaders, supervisors, and officers to start to address some of these beliefs. Our view at behavior change is that the way we're going to change behavior is by changing beliefs. So we've got to think about mechanisms that create belief change. And one way we recognize to create belief change is by having conversations. Conversations with ourselves, those are internal conversations, and then conversations with others. But that can be a very powerful way to start to shift beliefs. So we wanted to create a brief tool to help facilitate that. So what we did is create a little dialogue guide, and it looks like a one-page survey, really, and I'll expand it so you can see it better. But on the left-hand side, the officer would just be able to sit down and maybe spend 10 or 15 minutes and take this little survey. And it's not that they're going to turn this survey in. It's just a mechanism for them to think about these ideas and how much they agree or disagree with them. And it creates a platform for a conversation. And then in addition to the survey, we provided talking points to talk through each one of these 9 different statements. And those could be augmented clearly by the supervisors and leaders within an agency, but we wanted to give you a starting point to have those conversations. So here are the 9 statements that we asked folks, how much do you agree or disagree with? And we pulled these out of the survey as being important beliefs that if you could start to grow these beliefs, these would help facilitate behavior change. So the first one, just sort of, I believe the only acceptable number of deaths and serious injuries on our roadways should be 0. So we began with just a basic towards 0 death belief. And we at the center firmly believe that we're not going to get to 0 if we don't believe we can get to 0. And I know this is a hard thing to go for, but we feel like we've got to hold it out as the place that as a society is the only acceptable goal. And then we have to challenge ourselves to get there. So we wanted to be able to have some conversations about this. And this is also really about putting traffic safety in the context of public health. The second question as well is sort of checking in. Do they recognize how much a factor traffic crashes are as a public health issue? Because traffic crashes happen somewhat regularly, they aren't on the news as much. But as a public health issue, they are a major public health issue, and we need everyone to see that, as well as officers. We want to check in with, do they see their agency as being responsible for traffic safety? By no means solely responsible. Everyone has a responsibility, but law enforcement does have a responsibility, and to talk through that with officers. That regularly engaging in traffic safety enforcement does improve the safety of the communities. And this is where I think crash data could help. Officers, because they respond to crashes, they know crashes are still going on. An officer is never called to respond to a non-crash. So it's hard for officers to see that crashes may be decreasing because they still get called every time there is one. So this is where crash data could really come in and help an agency say, you know, over the past 5 or 10 years, you've decreased the number of fatal crashes in your community. That's a great thing. Keep it up. But without having that data, it can be difficult for an agency to recognize they're making an impact. And then they can become discouraged. It's the fifth question is checking out how the officer perceives the public and their impact of the public to influence traffic safety. And that high visibility enforcement can influence lots of people, not just the individual who's cited, but high visibility enforcement is really designed to impact all the other people as well. So it's starting to have that conversation about the power of high visibility enforcement. Number 6 is talking about, do warnings and citations affect behavior? And, there's discussion there. It's not the only thing that does. Perception of getting caught, like high visibility enforcement, has that influence. But there are opportunities to have that engagement and that warning and that conversation that can absolutely influence a driver's behavior. Engaging in traffic safety enforcement helps identify criminals so it can move beyond just traffic safety issues. I'll be positively recognized by my agency. So this is a good one for supervisors and leaders to maybe check in. Maybe they ask officers and maybe they think that they're positively recognizing their officers, but their officers don't feel like they're being positively recognized. And that's a gap that leaders and supervisors would want to address. So by asking that question, maybe they can learn that they're not doing a good job at recognizing. And then how do law enforcement officers, supervisors, and leaders perceive support from prosecutors and judges? And again, maybe there's support, maybe there isn't. Maybe that's an opportunity for some hard conversations or some important conversations with prosecutors and judges who they themselves may not recognize traffic safety as a major public health issue. Maybe we need some public advocates to have a conversation with our local prosecutors and judges to say, if you look at the data, this is what's causing harm in our community and we need to do a better job here. So there's a lot of opportunities to shift some beliefs internally and externally with stakeholders on that. So these were just 9 statements that we thought could foster some really good conversations. And again, these are the kinds of speaking points. I won't go through them all, but we provided speaking points for each one of those 9 just as a starting place so that a supervisor could sit down with his or her officers, talk through these and have something to say about it and foster some important conversation and hopefully start to shift some beliefs. So that resource is available as a part of the final report. We also may look at just pulling that tool out as a separate item so that You can just get quick access to that. But that's something we wanted to create as a mechanism to take some of the practical results of this project and allow individual leaders within agencies to use that tool. All right, so I just want to wrap things up by spending a few minutes and talk about some of our other research projects. We have 3 projects that are soon to be released. These are in final review. We've got a great key information guide about driving under the influence of cannabis or marijuana. We know that this is a growing concern. It's a growing challenge. Polydrug use is showing up more and more in fatal crashes. And we know that cannabis is often, alcohol along with cannabis tend to be the leading substances there. So this is a good summary of a lot of the research and some things we've learned from our surveys. So that'll be coming out soon. We've also developed a primer on traffic safety culture. This is a tool that anybody could use to foster a conversation about traffic safety culture. It also includes a PowerPoint, a poster, and a short video to promote it. So that'll be coming available. The primer itself is a short booklet that could be printed to really foster conversation about what do we mean by traffic safety culture, how do we grow it. We also have a primer on proactive traffic safety. These are behaviors that individuals could engage in that not only focus on their own safety, but the safety of others. So these are things like, how do I get a community not only to wear their seatbelt, but to get other people to wear a seatbelt? How could I get a community to promote positive traffic safety within our community and be supportive of high visibility enforcement or automated enforcement or other technologies that we know that can work? So it's we're calling it proactive traffic safety. And again, there's a PowerPoint, a poster, and then a written document, a primer about it. And those should be coming out in the next few really months. We're in the final stages. And then some research that's underway is we're looking at developing some guidance about evaluating traffic safety culture strategies. Traffic safety culture often occurs at the community level. So it's broad, it's big, and it's a little bit of a challenge to evaluate because it's not an individual strategy. So we're looking at some best practice guidance there. So this second project is around guidance on messaging to avoid reactance and moral disengagement. We're looking at seatbelt use as well as aggressive driving. And the question we're asking is, are people who, that 10% of the population on a national level who are not wearing their seatbelt, do they have a higher degree of psychological reactance? That is, do they have a tendency to push back when somebody tells them to do something? And if that's the case, are there ways that we can message to them that reduce that pushback? So we're going to look at that. That's going to be very interesting. And then we're also working on some tools and resources to increase engaged driving. And we're thinking about engaged driving from the broad perspective of being more focused on the driving task and recognizing that there are many behaviors that can distract us. When we reviewed the naturalistic driving study, it was interesting to see that multiple forms of distraction occur. It's not just cell phones. It can be talking to somebody in the vehicle. It can be reaching for an object. It could be all sorts of things. And so we really want to flip that conversation and say, how do we increase engaged driving, where we're just becoming more focused on the driving task? And we want to think about some tools and resources in the context of families as well as workplaces. 2 layers of the social ecology we feel like can really have some powerful impact on that. So these are further out. These are a couple of years away, but we're starting to engage in that research now, so you can just be aware of those. All right, so I want to come back to our sponsor, the Pooled Fund Project. Again, if you found some of this information of value, I'd encourage you to reach out to Sue Sillick. You can become on her emailing list. You could also becoming a participating member. We will be engaging in an additional 5 years of research, and we're very excited about the opportunities where we can go to talk about this issue of traffic safety and traffic safety culture. Okay, I'm going to jump and look at some of the questions that have come in. So when we talk about Yeah, so one question's come up before, and folks have reached out, and we always appreciate that. Does how the voting public considers traffic safety a primary concern? So we have done some research work on that as a part of some of our other projects. We have not specifically limited respondents to just the voting public. We've really looked at the public in general. We can try to share some of that out. We actually just collected a large sample in the state of Utah as a part of some of our seatbelt work, and we look at general support for example, traffic safety enforcement around seatbelt. And overwhelmingly, it tends to be in the 80 percentile. People are supportive of it. So I can continue to look in some of that. We don't have any good data on that on a national perspective. Maybe some other folks do. And that's something we'll continue to look at. But on a project basis, we tend to include that question, and we tend to find pretty good support on that. Let's see, some other things. Can my office get a copy of the engagement points for law enforcement? Absolutely. So that brief little tool we created is the last appendix of the full report. You can go to this website, and then from there, you can see all the projects we've done as a part of the Transportation Pooled Fund. And this is one of them. And the final report is there. And the very end of that final report are those tools. Well, also, I'll chat with Sue Sillick, and we maybe create a separate document that's just that survey and that tool. So you can get that document and just download that as a PDF. But you can certainly download the whole PDF and then just print the last 2 pages. So it's right there. Question came in, were you able to distinguish results about community support into 4 different category areas, especially speeding? So I'll go back and look in general. Well, when we look at surveys that we've done around community support for different kinds of enforcement, that has been, I'll have to go back and look. Several years ago, we did a statewide project in Minnesota, and we may looked at support enforcement for speeding and seatbelt and impaired. In general, we find, again, we haven't done a national project, but on all the projects we've done in different localities, you tend to find very strong support for enforcement on impaired driving. But we haven't done as much on speeding. So right off the top of my head, I don't know on speeding. Again, on this survey, this was only of officers. So we don't know what their communities were thinking. We're just comparing it to what we've done in other survey work. Let's see. And feel free to chat in any other questions, either in the chat box or in the question and answer. So yeah, it is. I mean, it's interesting in terms of a chat came in about how do people and officers perceive traffic safety as being real police work, and that tying it back to also identifying criminals can help with that. I think it certainly can, but I think it's also valuable just to be able to connect back and help with public safety. I think many officers may not realize that traffic safety is a major public health issue in terms of if we're really trying to prevent what kills people, often that's traffic safety issues. And so being able to talk about that can be very important and help shift that as well. Is there a reason to phrase the 9th question in the negative instead of the positive? No, that could be phrased positively or negatively. That's a good call out, and I think that could be adapted in a different context. Will the slides be available to view? So the entire presentation is recorded, so you can watch the recording. And I think we'll also probably put up a copy of the slide deck as well. Did the question about SFS training focus on initial or refresher training? Good call out. It was just had you participated in that training in the past 3 years. So we don't have a split on whether it was initial or refresher. That's a good call out. Well, I really want to thank you for all of your work on improving traffic safety, but also your time to engage with us today. We will share out a link for the recording of this so that you can watch it with others or share it with others. And then you can also go to this website to connect with those tools, the final report and other tools. All right. So thank you very much for your time today, and wear your seatbelt. Take care.